Hello and thank you for tuning in. In this lecture I would like to deal with some myths about vitamin B12. I do not have time to deal with all myths, but I will deal with some prevalent ones. However, before we get to myths versus truths about this particular nutrient, I need to give you a little bit of background about this vitamin. First of all, it is very complicated nutrient in terms of its chemical structure. It has the largest chemical structure of all vitamins, and it contains an element cobalt in its structure, which makes it very unique. No other vitamins contains this or other minerals in its structure. Vitamin B12 is only made by microorganisms. Sometimes, if you are a member of Facebook, for example, or if you are a vegetarian in some circles, people use an argument that they don't want to, say, take a supplement of vitamin B12 because they don't want to use a synthetic form of vitamin B12. There is no such a thing as a synthetic form of vitamin B12. Vitamin B12, it's only made by microorganisms, bacteria. Okay, vitamin B12 that is available as a supplement is isolated from the bacteria and stabilized, usually with a cyanide to make it stable, so it will not degrade very quickly. At this stage of knowledge, scientists are unable to make a synthetic form of vitamin B12 because of the complexity of this particular nutrient. Vitamin B12 belongs to a group of compounds known as corinoids. In this group of compounds we have active vitamin B12 compounds, which are listed here on this slide: cyanocobalamin, hydroxycobalamin, methylcobalamin, and adenosylcobalamin. In reality, the last two only are truly active and can be utilized in our cells. However, the vast majority of people can quite easily convert cyanocobalamin and hydroxycobalamin into either one of these active forms. And so if they take this from, say, foods fortified with vitamin B12 or as supplements, they should have no issue whatsoever. There are, however, there's a small number of people that lacks the enzyme that converts these inactive compounds into methylcobalamin or adenosylcobalamin, and they have to take either of the two or they will develop deficiency. However, what's also important to remember is that there are some inactive vitamin B12 analogs, also known as pseudocobalamins, that belong to the same group of compounds. And oftentimes this is an area of confusion because some people, for example, believe that products such as fermented soya products contain vitamin B12. These products contain the inactive vitamin B12 analogs, not the active vitamin B12 compounds. Vitamin B12 is needed in the body for many different functions, a variety of different functions. I actually just listed a few of them here, but there are many, many more. And so number one, the important information is that it is needed for all new cells because it is needed for DNA synthesis. It actually is needed for activation of folic acid, which is needed for DNA synthesis. So it is especially important in growing fetus and young children because they manufacture new cells very rapidly. Vitamin B12 is also needed for myelin synthesis. Myelin is sort of a coating on nerve pathways, and B12 deficiency will result in deterioration of these nerve pathways and will cause neurological problems. Further, it is needed for the formation of red blood cells, and in fact all blood cells, not just red blood cells. So that includes platelets, and it does include white blood cells. I remember when I first became a vegetarian, which was about 30 years ago, some vegetarians that I encountered at the time had this very interesting argument to support vegetarianism. They would say that vegetarians have a lower count of white blood cells, and they attributed that to the fact that, well, they don't eat meat, therefore they don't eat some microorganism, and they don't need a strong immune system to fight some of these microorganisms, and that was the reason for having a lower white blood cell count. Today I know that vegetarians do oftentimes have a lower white blood cell count, but this has very little to do with fighting microorganisms, but it has a lot to do with the status of vitamin B12. Compromised or poor vitamin B12 status will result in a low white blood cell count. Also, vitamin B12 is needed for energy synthesis, and people who have vitamin B12 deficiency oftentimes experience lack of energy. In fact, many people who didn't even realize that they had vitamin B12 deficiency, if they do take vitamin B12 supplements, they will feel a burst of energy. Okay, I actually could share a number of stories related to this if I had time, and I don't have time, so I will just move on. Vitamin B12 is a very interesting vitamin, and interestingly, in foods, vitamin B12 is bound to protein. And in order to absorb vitamin B12, we need to first split vitamin B12 from that protein that it is bound to in food. In order to do so, we need strong hydrochloric acid and adequate synthesis of an enzyme known as pepsinogen. That's an inactive form of this enzyme. Hydrochloric acid actually activates this enzyme to pepsin, and pepsin actually does the splitting or the releasing of vitamin B12 from food. Furthermore, we need something called the intrinsic factor. An intrinsic factor is manufactured in the stomach, just like the hydrochloric acid and this enzyme pepsinogen. And so this shows us the important role of the stomach in the absorption of vitamin B12. Remember, unless we split vitamin B12 from the protein, we will never be able to absorb it. Also, unless we are able to secrete or manufacture the intrinsic factor that then binds to vitamin B12, we will never be able to absorb this vitamin B12, except if we ingest very large amounts of vitamin B12, known as pharmacological effect, in case of using vitamin B12 supplements. In that case, a very small amount, about 1% or less of the ingested dose, will be able to sort of slip itself into the bloodstream. Here's the first statement, and we will decide whether this particular statement can qualify as a myth or truth. The human body stores several years' worth of vitamin B12, so nutritional deficiency of this vitamin is extremely rare. Although people who follow a strict vegetarian diet, that's another way of saying vegan diet, and do not consume eggs or dairy products, may require vitamin B12 supplement or supplements. I want to point out a few things, or two things at least, before we decide on whether this is myth or truth. First, it was written by someone with MD, medical doctor, someone who should have a training and should have an understanding of this particular nutrient or nutrients in general. Secondly, up until 2008, this statement was issued on the National Institute of Medicine, which is a website that is administered by the National Institutes of Health. And so, considering the following, we would assume that this is something that would be worth believing in and accepting as truth. Yet, I would like to introduce you to at least three. There are actually more than three myths in this statement, but I will focus on at least on these three myths, why, or three reasons why this statement is a myth. Myth number 1A: B12 or vitamin B12 deficiency is not extremely rare. In fact, it is very common, and I will elaborate on this in a second. And then myth number 1B: humans may or may not store B12 for several years. Regardless, it is irrelevant. I will explain this in a second. Myth number 1C: not just strict vegetarians or vegans may require vitamin B12 supplements. In fact, there are a number of groups of people that may require this supplement, including other vegetarians, not just vegans, including people who have undergone some type of gastrointestinal surgery, including people who have some type of gastrointestinal issues, such as people with celiac disease or Crohn's disease, including people who have diabetes and take metformin, the drug metformin, including people who have some type of thyroid issue, including people who are elderly and may have a problem with secreting strong enough hydrochloric acid and secreting intrinsic factors, and so on and so on. I will elaborate on some of these right now. First, let's look at myth number 1A. B12 deficiency is not extremely rare. It is very common. Here's a quote from a manuscript published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in 2009. I mean, so relatively recent. How common is vitamin B12 deficiency? Vitamin B12 deficiency and depletion are common in wealthier countries, particularly among the elderly, and are most prevalent in poorer populations around the world. Question before we read further: does this sound like just a few vegans here and there may develop a deficiency of this vitamin? Absolutely not. Are common, are most prevalent. Further, we read, this prevalence was underestimated in the past for several reasons, including the erroneous belief that deficiency is unlikely except in strict vegetarians or patients with pernicious anemia, and that it usually takes 20 years for stores of the vitamin to become depleted. I supply the emphasis here. The underlying was not in the original quote. Further, we read, pernicious anemia is a condition that results from vitamin B12 deficiency, is a common cause of megaloblastic anemia throughout the world, and especially in persons of European or African descent. Dietary deficiency of vitamin B12 due to vegetarianism is increasing and causes hyperhomocysteinemia. Further, we read, dietary vitamin B12 deficiency is a severe problem in the Indian subcontinent, Mexico, Central and South America, and selected areas in Africa. Dietary vitamin B12 deficiency is not prevalent in Asia except in vegetarians. And so we find, based on these readings, based on these quotes, that it is extremely prevalent rather than extremely rare. So this quote that we looked at in the very beginning, and we were trying to decide whether it was truth or myth, it is 100% myth and nothing but myth. Let's consider reason number 2 why this statement was a myth. Humans may or may not store B12 for several years? Irrelevant. We already read a statement that the idea that only some vegetarians or strict vegetarians may develop this, and that the deficiency may take 20 years or so for developing, was erroneous belief. But let's consider this a bit further. What we need to realize is that in serum, vitamin B12 has at least two different carriers. In fact, these two that I listed here, haptocorrin and holotranscobalamin 2, are the most important ones. At any given point of time, at least 80% of the vitamin B12 that is found in the serum is found in haptocorrin. But it could be as much as 100% of that vitamin in serum is found in haptocorrin. So holotranscobalamin, or the portion of vitamin B12 found in haptocorrin, in holotranscobalamin 2, could be no more than 20%. This is very important information because vitamin B12 from diet, or vitamin B12 that is absorbed through gastrointestinal tract, is always incorporated into holotranscobalamin 2. And vitamin B12 from our stores from different cells in the body is always carried by haptocorrin. And so if we do not provide adequate amount of vitamin B12 in our diet, less of vitamin B12 will be found in holotranscobalamin 2. In fact, it could be as much as 0 or close to it. Why is this important? Because vitamin B12 can be provided or can be supplied to some cells of the body, including some neurological cells, some brain cells, only via holotranscobalamin 2 and not via haptocorrin. And so even if we do have stores of vitamin B12 that are worth 20 years or 10 years or 5 years or 25 years, it could be irrelevant until or unless we have adequate amount of this vitamin B12 in this other carrier known as holotranscobalamin 2. That's point number one. But point number two, this idea that we have so much vitamin B12 stored in our body is based on the capacity of how much we are capable of storing of this vitamin B12. Now, how many of us know how much we actually have stored? Do we have the capacity filled to 100%? Is it only 50%, 25%, 10%, maybe less? None of us really knows that. I would like to suggest that if you are an elderly, if you are a vegetarian, or if you have some type of absorption issues, or in a variety of other groups of people, this storage of vitamin B12 or this capacity that we have of storing vitamin B12 is not filled to 100%. It may be much lower, or it may be completely depleted. Furthermore, I would like us to look at some interesting results of a few studies here. Here's one. This study was based on 15 vegans who adhered to this particular diet for 2 years, or actually a bit longer than 2 years. And for this, or during this period of time, they used vitamin B12 supplements, either 3 to 10 micrograms per day, or 2,000 micrograms weekly. So either or, okay? Some of them use 3 to 10 micrograms of vitamin B12 as a supplement per day. Others use 2,000 micrograms weekly. Researchers who conducted this study measured serum vitamin B12 in the beginning of the experiment. The average concentration was 259, and then also 3 months after they stopped using the supplements that they used prior to the experiment. So up until the beginning of the study, they used these supplements I mentioned earlier. From the beginning of the study, they stopped using these supplements. Notice that within 3 months, the serum vitamin B12 level dropped by almost 25%. Similarly, on the right-hand side of the slide, we have a serum homocysteine level. Homocysteine is a proxy for vitamin B12 status. So elevated homocysteine oftentimes indicates vitamin B12 deficiency. Notice that serum homocysteine increased, which is corresponding to the lowering of serum vitamin B12. Here we have results of another study. In this particular study, they actually used 2 different groups of individuals. In the first one, data on the left, this data is based on 13 individuals, and then data on the right, this is based on 10 individuals. These individuals were actually lacto-ovo vegetarians prior to beginning of the study, and then they switched to a vegan diet after that period of time, or at the beginning of the study rather. And notice the change in serum vitamin B12 level 2 months later. So in the beginning of the study, the serum vitamin B12 was 467. 2 months later, it was 306, which is almost 35% decrease. When it comes to the other group, in the beginning we see 417. 2 months later, 276, which is 34% decrease. This is after 2 months, not 2 years, not 10 years, not 20 years. After 2 months, how serum vitamin B12 dropped. Here we have another study. This is from 2008. This was a study with older fellows, a mean age 82 years. And in this particular study, they actually, the researchers gave these individuals a supplement of vitamin B12 in a dose of 1,000 micrograms per day for 6 months. And notice how vitamin B12 concentration changed in this period of time. So in the beginning of the study, the graph in blue, the serum B12 was 206. 6 months later, after again they used these supplements, it was on average 642. We also have here data for holotranscobalamin 2. This is the carrier of vitamin B12 that I mentioned earlier. In the beginning of the study, it was 65. 6 months later, it was 281. But here's the interesting point. At 6 months, they stopped using the supplements. And this data illustrates how their serum concentration, holotranscobalamin, and methylmalonic acid, which is another measure of vitamin B12 status, changed over time, 3 months, 5 months, and 7 months later. We can find here that when it comes to serum cobalamin or serum vitamin B12, about 3 months later, 5 months later, 7 months later, it dropped by about 50% already. That's 3 months, 5 months, 7 months. Again, we are not talking years. Similarly, holotranscobalamin, we find even further drop, more than 50% here. And when it comes to methylmalonic acid, which is very accurate measure of vitamin B12 status, just like it is for holotranscobalamin, we find an elevated level. Elevated methylmalonic acid indicates vitamin B12 deficiency. The third reason, myth number 1C, why this was a myth. Not just strict vegetarians or vegans may require vitamin B12 supplements. In fact, I listed a number of different groups, but let me focus on vegetarians specifically here. Here's one of my publications. This was a review publication or review manuscript, How Prevalent is Vitamin B12 Deficiency Among Vegetarians? And here we have a quote. The deficiency rates reported for specific populations were as follows. 62% among pregnant women, between 25% and almost 86% among children, 21 to 41% among adolescents, and 11 to 90% among elderly. The big ranges here, 11 to 90%, 21 to 41, and so on, depends on the deficiency definition, because different researchers use different criteria of what they consider a deficiency. So if we have more stringent criteria, we would have higher percentage of people classified as deficient. And another quote from the same manuscript, the main finding of this review is that vegetarians develop B12 depletion or deficiency regardless of demographic characteristics, place of residency, age, or type of vegetarian diet they consume. So again, not just strict vegetarians, not just a few vegans, but all vegetarians develop vitamin B12 deficiency. How about this one? Some people may develop a biochemical deficiency without corresponding clinical symptoms. Truth or myth? Myth or truth? I believe it is a myth. It is actually a myth that is relatively prevalent among some respected scientists. Let me mention why I believe this. This is a quote from one of my newest book, Vegan Vegetarian Mother and Her Baby. Low intake of vitamin B12 during pregnancy is associated with acute lymphoblastic leukemia in childhood. Now, how many people would attribute vitamin B12 deficiency during pregnancy as a reason, or at least as a factor that would increase the risk for leukemia in childhood? Here's another one. Vitamin B12 deficiency has also been associated with infertility and inability to carry a live pregnancy to term. How many couples, when they go for counseling, they cannot conceive, they try, they cannot conceive. How many of them are told, oh, have you checked your vitamin B12 level? The answer is none. These issues are usually not even considered, and yet it is a well-known, documented fact that B12 deficiency causes infertility in both males and females. How many women who aborted the fetus spontaneously were checked for vitamin B12 deficiency? What I am trying to show here is that oftentimes symptoms develop, symptoms of vitamin B12 deficiency develop or occur that we don't even consider as symptoms of this particular vitamin. Many women are familiar with the fact that a deficiency of folic acid or inadequate intake of folic acid may cause something called neurotube defects such as spina bifida or anencephaly or some others. How many people realize that vitamin B12 deficiency or low maternal vitamin B12 status can cause the same problem? Yet here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different studies. And with one exception, all of these studies pointed to the fact that low maternal vitamin B12 status increases the risk, oftentimes many times, of having a baby with neurotube defects, such as spina bifida. Here we have an interesting study, age-related hearing loss, vitamin B12, and folate in elderly women. Here we have the average concentration of vitamin B12 in serum. Those with the average vitamin B12 456 had hearing classified as perfect, those with 312 as good, and those with only 236 had their hearing classified as impaired. I repeat my question. How many people who have hearing problem, when they go to a physician, are told, have you checked your vitamin B12 level? The answer is virtually none. Here's another study. Low bone mineral density and bone mineral content are associated with low cobalamin status in adolescents. Cobalamin, again, that's vitamin B12. Vitamin B12. Here we have a comparison of bone mineral density among those with the average serum vitamin B12 286 versus 458. We find that there is a difference of 0.04 grams per centimeter square. And so, again, we develop symptoms without even realizing this. Oftentimes, these symptoms will not manifest themselves as symptoms until many, many years later. Here is another example. This is a study that was conducted in Hong Kong. Vitamin B12 supplementation improves arterial function in vegetarians with subnormal vitamin B12 status. They included 50 healthy vegetarians in this particular study, mean age 45 years. They were vegetarians for at least 6 years. Okay, so they had several phases, as we can see here on this slide. 2 of these phases included using a supplement of vitamin B12 in the dose of 500 micrograms per day. And here are the results. I will just focus on the quote, which will actually explain this particular results. Vitamin B12 supplementation in asymptomatic vegetarians with compromised vitamin B12 status may lead to a significant improvement in arterial endothelial function and carotid intima media thickness, with potential benefit on cardiovascular health. I don't have time to explain all the terms in here. What this conclusion is saying here is that if we have compromised vitamin B12 status, it will actually have an impact on the development of atherosclerosis in our arteries. And in this particular studies, they documented that taking vitamin B12 supplement and correcting the status of vitamin B12 improved the atherosclerosis changes in the arteries. Here's another something to consider for truth or myth. Vegans and/or vegetarians require less B12 than omnivores do. I actually have 2 different quotes here from different sources that sort of support this particular statement. Let me just read the first one. It is quite likely then that vegan diet would require no more than 0.05 micrograms of B12 daily. Now, here is a study, Adventist Ministers' Health Study, in which 340 Australian 7-day Adventist ministers were included. 245 of them were lacto-ovo vegetarians or vegans, and they were not taking a supplement of vitamin B12. We find an interesting quote in this manuscript. Data from the dietary questionnaires supported dietary deficiency as the cause of low serum vitamin B12 in this population of lacto-ovo vegetarians and vegans. 56, 23% of whom consumed sufficient servings of vitamin B12 containing foods to obtain the minimum daily maintenance allowance of the vitamin, 1 micrograms. Okay? I want to point out that according to this quote, 56 of these people were diagnosed with deficiency regardless of the fact that they consumed 1 micrograms of vitamin B12. I want to scroll back to this quote, which says it is quite likely that vegan diet would require no more than 0.05 micrograms of vitamin B12. 0.05. This quote is saying 1 micrograms, many times more. And so here, with these people consume many times more of this vitamin, and they were already diagnosed with deficiency than what this quote is saying should be sufficient if someone consumes a vegan diet. By the way, in this particular study, we find that vegans had the lowest serum vitamin B12 concentration, 166, then vegetarians 199, and non-vegetarians the highest, and 73% of them had vitamin B12 deficiency. Let's consider another quote. There are several vegetarian food sources of vitamin B12. These include wheat, soybeans, various common greens, olives, fruits, roots and stem of tomatoes, cabbage, celery, kale, broccoli and leeks, the leaves of kohlrabi, seaweed and alfalfa containing B12. It is difficult to avoid B12. This quote comes from a relatively well-read author and a relatively well-distributed book. I purposely did not include the name of the author or of the book because the author isn't here to sort of argue her points. But I will show you that this is basically nonsense. This information that is in this particular quote is an old myth and can be easily classified as nonsense. Here's sort of a next part of this particular myth. Vegetarians can obtain B12 from foods such as fermented soya product, example tempeh, okay, seaweed, algae, nori, spirulina, living vitamin supplements made from plants, probiotics, plant foods, spinach, tomatoes, broccoli, cabbage, kale, etc., water. Now, none of this is a reliable source. Some of this might have slight amounts. Some data shows that some algae contains some amounts, but these are not reliable sources of vitamin B12, and they oftentimes contain those vitamin B12 analogs. Just to support my points with respected scientists in the field. The first one comes from Dr. Victor Herbert, whom I believe was one of the prominent scientists, one of the foremost experts on vitamin B12. He died a few years ago, so he's no longer with us. There is no active vitamin B12 in anything that grows out of the ground. Storage vitamin B12 is found only in animal products where it is ambiguous and where it is ultimately derived from bacteria. The second quote, Dr. Allen, the vitamin is present only in animal source foods or fortified foods. Here's another quote from Dr. Herbert. We studied several types of tempeh, including original soya tempeh. And I can't quite pronounce this, but whatever culture, with a label claim of 160% of the US RDA, that means US recommendation, for vitamin B12 per 4 ounces. Using the differential radioassay, we found there was practically no vitamin B12 in it. We also studied most of the spirulina sold in health food stores as sources of vitamin B12. There's practically no vitamin B12 in them. The so-called vitamin B12 is almost exclusively analogs of vitamin B12, and we have extracted the 2 largest peaks of analogs, and they actually block vitamin B12 metabolism. Okay? So what these researchers are saying is this: we suspect that people taking spirulina as a source of vitamin B12 may get vitamin B12 deficiency quicker because the analogs in the product block human mammalian cell metabolism in culture, and we suspect they will also do this in the living human. Remember that the label claim of vitamin B12 is actually a claim of corinoid content, not vitamin B12 content. That means the pseudocobalamin or the B12 supplements rather than the true vitamin B12. So based on what I shared with you, I would like to conclude that vitamin B12 deficiency is a worldwide problem. Vegetarians develop vitamin B12 deficiency regardless of the type of diet they adhere to. And then vitamin B12 deficiency does not have to take a long time to develop. Further, vitamin B12 is not found in foods of plant origin. Taking algae, example nori or spirulina, or fermented soya products will not prevent vitamin B12 deficiency from developing. In fact, we mentioned they may actually contribute to the development of this deficiency quicker. And then deficiency results in hematological, neurological, psychiatric, and other types of symptoms. I would like to take time to end this with just mentioning to you that you can get more information in my recent books. Here's the most recent one, A Vegan Vegetarian Mother and Her Baby. And there's a lot of more information about the importance of vitamin B12 during pregnancy, lactation, and then in the development of infant children and adolescents. But this book also contains a number of other important information for vegetarians and vegans, such as, for example, what would be the best way to make sure that deficiencies of vitamin B12, iron, zinc do not develop, how to get the so-called fish oil if you are vegetarian or vegan. Can you use soya formula, or can you feed soya products to your children? Also, I have another book called In Defense of Vegetarianism, and this is more so for adults. And here again, I discuss a variety of issues that are important for vegetarians. From number one, the impact of vegetarian diets on chronic health conditions, but also the importance or the impact of adopting a vegetarian lifestyle on the environment. I also discuss some pitfalls of vegetarianism and a variety of other issues. Also, in this book, Forever Young, I deal with prevalent health conditions for the elderly. As we age, we have a higher risk for developing a variety of different problems, including heart disease, but also diabetes, arthritis, high blood pressure, heartburn, constipation, osteoporosis, dementia, cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease, and so on. And I outline different principles that will help to prevent these conditions, and in some cases will actually help to even reverse them. I also deal with specific issues related to vitamin B12 for older adults and elderly in this particular book. Lastly, I would like to recommend my book, Healthy Diet Without Secrets. We have so many different diets and so many different ideas about what's a healthy diet. In fact, it seems like a sea of confusion, since one person's recommendations sometimes are completely different than another person's recommendations, and oftentimes physicians and other health professionals stand by these different recommendations that are really completely different from each other. So I deal with a variety of issues here, and I support my recommendations. I don't have my own diet, but my recommendations are supported by a number of different scientific research, and again I answer pertinent questions for people who are interested in healthy eating. So I hope you can obtain this. You can obtain them either from Amazon. They are available in electronic forms, or you can contact ABC stores, Adventist book centers, and you can also contact me directly. My email address is Romucha, ROMUCHA @hotmail.com. Thank you very much.